Question 94. Grounds of political obligation and political obligations under the divine right theory and the social contract theory. Introduction, meaning and nature of political obligation. Political obligation is one of the most fundamental questions of political philosophy. It asks why individuals should obey the laws of the state and what justifies the state's authority over them. In simple terms, political obligation means the moral duty of citizens to obey the laws, commands, and institutions of the state. It explores the ethical foundation of political obedience, whether we obey because of fear, consent, morality, or divine will. Every theory of political obligation tries to answer the same question from a different perspective. The divine right theory sees obedience as a religious duty. The social contract theory sees it as a rational and voluntary agreement. To understand these, we must first outline the general grounds of political obligation, the basic reasons why human beings owe obedience to the state. Grounds of political obligation. The grounds of political obligation are the philosophical justifications for why individuals should accept and follow the authority of the state. Over time, different thinkers have proposed various grounds: theological, rational, moral, and social. 1. The necessity of order and security. The most immediate ground of political obligation is the need for peace, order, and security. Without political authority, life would descend into chaos, as Hobbes described in his State of Nature, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The state, by enforcing laws and punishing wrongdoers, ensures social stability. Obedience to laws becomes a moral necessity for the preservation of life and society. Example: traffic rules or laws against theft are obeyed not just because of penalties, but because they ensure safety and collective order. 2. The common good. Another moral basis of political obligation is the common good, the belief that individuals owe obedience because the state promotes collective welfare. When citizens obey just laws, they contribute to the functioning of society and the good of all. This view, associated with Aristotle and later T.H. Green, emphasizes that humans are social beings who realize their moral potential through participation in the political community. Thus, obedience is not servitude but cooperation for a shared moral purpose. 3. Consent of the governed. According to Locke and other social contract theorists, political obligation arises from the consent of the people, either express or implied. Individuals obey the state because they have agreed, formally or tacitly, to form a political community for mutual protection and welfare. In modern democracies, this is reflected in the principle of popular sovereignty. The state's authority derives from the consent of its citizens. 4. Legal and moral duty. Some philosophers, such as Kant and Green, argue that obedience to law is a moral duty, not merely a legal or utilitarian requirement. Laws express the moral will of the community, and citizens obey them as an act of moral self-realization. Thus, political obligation is not forced, it arises from the recognition that a just state is the embodiment of moral order. 5. Gratitude and reciprocity. This argument suggests that citizens owe obedience to the state out of gratitude for the protection, rights, and services it provides. Since the state ensures security, education, infrastructure, and welfare, individuals have a duty to obey in return. However, this ground is valid only if the state truly serves its citizens. Blind obedience to an unjust state cannot be justified by gratitude alone. 6. Natural and historical necessity. Political obligation may also arise from the natural evolution of society. Humans are born into political communities, inherit their institutions, and thus owe allegiance as part of their social inheritance. Aristotle called man a political animal, suggesting that political obedience is a natural condition of human life, not an artificial imposition. Summary of grounds. Political obligation is grounded in the need for order, the common good, consent, moral duty, reciprocity, and social nature of man. Each of these grounds finds expression in different theories, most notably the divine right theory and the social contract theory, which offer two contrasting explanations of why we obey. 2. The divine right theory of political obligation. 1. Meaning and basic premise. The divine right theory is a theological explanation of political obligation. It asserts that the authority of the ruler is derived directly from God, and therefore, subjects have a moral and religious duty to obey him. The king rules by divine will, not by the consent of the people. Disobedience to the ruler is thus equivalent to disobedience to God. 2. Major thinkers and historical background. The theory was prevalent in medieval Europe and reached its height during the absolutist monarchies of the 16th and 17th centuries. Notable advocates include King James I of England, who declared, "Kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth, but even by God himself called gods." Sir Robert Filmer, in Patriarcha 1680, argued that political authority originated from Adam's paternal authority given by God, inherited by monarchs. This theory provided a religious justification for absolute monarchy and unquestioned obedience. 3. Grounds of obligation in the divine right theory. Political obligation, according to this theory, rests on religious duty. Since God is the supreme source of all power, the king, as his representative, commands divine legitimacy. Citizens must obey not because of law or consent, but because it is their spiritual obligation. The command of the ruler is the command of God. Hence, obedience is absolute, unconditional, and eternal. Example, monarchs like Louis XIV of France, "I am the state," embodied this idea, considering rebellion a sin against divine authority. 4. Criticisms. The divine right theory faced strong opposition during the Enlightenment. 1. Undermines human freedom, it denies people's rational and moral autonomy. 2. Justifies tyranny, by claiming divine sanction, it shields rulers from accountability. 3. Lacks rational and empirical basis, no evidence supports divine delegation of political power. 4. Suppresses the right to resistance, subjects cannot oppose even the most unjust ruler. 5. Contradicted by democratic principles, it negates the idea of popular sovereignty. John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Rousseau rejected this theory, arguing that political authority arises from human agreement, not divine decree. 5. Decline and legacy. The theory collapsed with the rise of constitutionalism and democracy. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England marked its practical end, replacing divine kingship with popular sovereignty and rule of law. Yet, the theory historically legitimized the early consolidation of states, providing a unifying moral force before secular politics evolved. 3. The social contract theory of political obligation. 1. Meaning and basic idea. The social contract theory provides a rational and secular justification for political obligation. It asserts that the state is not divinely ordained but created by a voluntary agreement, contract, among individuals who sought to escape the chaos of the state of nature. By entering into this contract, individuals consent to obey the laws and authority of the state in exchange for security, justice, and order. Thus, political obligation rests on consent and reciprocity, not divine will. 2 major thinkers. I. Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, Contract for Security. In his Leviathan, 1651, Hobbes described life in the state of nature as anarchic and violent. To escape this, people entered a contract to surrender their rights to a sovereign who would maintain peace and order. Political obligation is absolute because the sovereign ensures protection. Rebellion would return society to chaos. Thus, for Hobbes, fear and necessity, not divine will, are the grounds of obedience. 2. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, Contract for Rights and Welfare. Locke's two treatises of government, 1690, portrayed the state of nature as peaceful but insecure. People formed government to protect their natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Obedience is conditional. If the government violates these rights, citizens have the right to resistance. Thus, political obligation rests on consent and the moral duty to uphold natural rights. 3. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, Contract for Freedom. In the Social Contract, 1762, Rousseau proposed that individuals unite to form a general will, the collective moral will of the people. Political obligation arises from obedience to laws that citizens have made for themselves. By obeying the general will, individuals are truly free because they submit to a moral authority of their own making. Thus, Rousseau's theory transforms political obligation into self-obligation, a moral act of autonomy and equality. 3 grounds of political obligation in the social contract theory. 1. Consent. Individuals voluntarily agree to form and obey the state. 2. Utility. The state provides protection and order. 3. Moral duty. Obedience is owed to laws representing the general will or natural rights. 4. Conditional loyalty. If the state becomes unjust, obligation ceases. 4. Significance. The social contract theory replaced divine authority with human reason and consent, laying the philosophical foundation of modern democracy, rule of law, and constitutional government. It transformed subjects into citizens and obedience into rational cooperation. 5. Criticisms. 1. Hypothetical contract. No real historical contract ever occurred. 2. Excessive individualism treats individuals as isolated agents rather than social beings. 3. Unrealistic assumptions. The state of nature is a theoretical abstraction. 4. Limited participation. Locke early versions ignored gender and class inequality. However, its moral and political influence endures as the foundation of democratic legitimacy. 4. Comparative analysis. Divine right versus social contract. The divine right theory and the social contract theory represent two opposite poles of political thought. Aspect. Source of authority. Nature of power. Ground of obligation. Divine right theory. God. Absolute and hereditary. Social contract theory. The people. Limited and conditional. Religious duty, consent and reason. Allowed if. Right to. Resistance. View of. Individual. Not allowed. Subject. Type of state monarchy. Government violates contract. Citizen. Democratic constitutional. The transition from divine kingship to contractual democracy marks humanity's journey from theocracy to reason, from obedience to authority toward obedience to conscience. Summary for quick understanding. Political obligation is the moral duty to obey the state's authority. Its grounds include order, the common good, consent, gratitude, and moral duty. Divine right theory. Authority of rulers derived from God. Obedience is religious and absolute. Denies people's rights and freedom. Collapsed with rise of democracy and rationalism. Social contract theory. State created by voluntary agreement. Political obligation based on consent and welfare. Obedience is conditional and rational. Foundation of modern democratic thought. Quick revision notes. Political obligation. Divine right theory. Duty to obey the state. Obedience to God. Social contract theory. From consent. Hobbies. Obedience to king is equal to. Obedience arises. Absolute obligation for peace. Locke. Conditional obligation for rights. Rousseau. Will. Moral obligation to the general. Modern relevance. Basis of democracy, rule of law, and citizen responsibility. One-line questions and answers for revision. 1. What is political obligation? The moral duty of citizens to obey the state's laws. 2. On what basis does the divine right theory justify obedience? On divine command and religious duty. 3. Who was the chief proponent of the divine right theory in England? King James I and Robert Filmer. 4. What marks the end of the divine right theory in England? The Glorious Revolution of 1688. 5. What is the basis of political obligation in the social contract theory? Consent and rational agreement. 6. Who wrote Leviathan? Thomas Hobbes. 7. According to Locke, when does political obligation end? When government violates natural rights. 8. What is Rousseau's idea of the general will? The collective moral will of citizens. 9. Which theory promotes the idea of popular sovereignty? Social contract theory. 10. What is the main difference between the two theories? One bases authority on God, the other on the consent of the people. Final connection. The divine right theory sanctified obedience through religion, while the social contract theory justified it through reason and consent. The evolution from divine to contractual obligation symbolize the moral and intellectual liberation of humanity, from blind submission to the conscious exercise of freedom and duty. In the modern democratic state, political obligation stands not on divine command but on the moral responsibility of citizens to uphold laws that embody justice, liberty, and the common good.